Stand in the Eurotas Valley today, and you will find olive groves, a quiet Greek town, and almost nothing else. No great ruins, no marble temples. Thucydides predicted this 24 centuries ago. If Sparta were ever abandoned, he wrote, future generations would never believe it had been a superpower. Hollywood tells you Sparta was 300 men holding a pass against 1,000,000, the greatest warriors who ever lived. The record tells a stranger story, a state that enslaved an entire nation and lived in fear of it, an army that could be defeated, outmaneuvered, and even forced to surrender, a society so rigid it ran out of citizens and faded, not conquered from outside, but hollowed out from within. This is the entire history of Sparta, not the legend, the evidence, gaps and arguments left in plain sight. And by the end, you will have to decide for yourself. Was Sparta the greatest city in Greece, or the greatest story ever told about one? The valley is waiting. Let's go down to the Eurotas. Chapter 1. The Valley Before the Legend. Every story about Sparta begins with a picture in the imagination, and it is worth clearing that picture away before we take a single step. When you hear the word Sparta, you probably see something harsh. Bare rock, thin soil, a cold country that punishes weakness, the kind of landscape that would naturally produce hard men. That picture feels right. It is also almost exactly backwards. Come down from the mountains and look at what is actually there. The Eurotas River runs south through the region of Laconia, in the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese, the great peninsula that hangs off the bottom of mainland Greece. On either side of the river stand two mountain ranges. To the west rises Taygetus, a wall of stone climbing to nearly 8,000 feet, snow-capped for much of the year. To the east runs the lower range of Parnon, and between those walls lies the valley itself. By the standards of ancient Greece, it is a paradise. Greece is a hard country for farmers. Most of it is mountain and thin soil, which is why Greek cities fought endlessly over scraps of arable land and sent their surplus people overseas as colonists. But the Eurotas Valley is different. The river feeds it. The mountains shelter it. Ancient writers praised Laconia for its grain, its olives, its wine, and its horses. When Homer described this region, he called it Hollow Lacedaemon, a rich land cradled between the ranges. Hold on to that. The most famously austere society in history grew up on some of the best farmland in Greece. Sparta's hardness was not forced on it by nature. Somewhere along the way, it was chosen. Why anyone would choose it is the central mystery of this story, and the answer is waiting 2 chapters ahead. But first, we owe this valley its deeper past, because Sparta was not the first power to rule it. Long before the Spartans, in the Bronze Age, the valley belonged to the world of the Mycenaeans. This was the Greece of legend, the Greece of the Trojan War, a civilization of palaces and chariots and kings who kept their accounts on clay tablets. And in myth, the king of this valley was a name you already know, Menelaus, husband of Helen, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. In Homer's telling, Helen of Troy was really Helen of Sparta. It was from this valley that she was taken, and to this valley that she returned when the war was over. Is there anything real underneath the poetry? Something, yes, on a hilltop a few miles from the later city, archaeologists have excavated a Bronze Age site, now called the Menelaon, where a substantial Mycenaean building stood in the 13th century BC, and where, centuries later, Greeks left offerings inscribed to Menelaus and Helen. None of this proves a historical Helen ever lived. What it proves is almost as interesting. The people who later called themselves Spartans knew they were living in a haunted landscape, on ground that had belonged to heroes, and they never stopped claiming that inheritance. Then, around 1200 BC, the palace world died. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history, the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed within a few generations. Palaces burned from Greece to the Levant. Trade routes failed. Writing itself was forgotten in Greece and stayed forgotten for centuries. Historians still argue about the cause. Some point to drought and famine, some to earthquakes, some to the sea-borne raiders that Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. And the honest answer is probably several of these disasters feeding on each other. Whatever the cause, the effect in Laconia is visible in the archaeology. The Mycenaean sites shrink or fall silent. The valley of Menelaus goes dark. And into that darkness, at some point in the following centuries, came new people, the Dorians. Later, Greeks told this as a clean story of invasion. Dorian tribesmen from the north, they said, swept into the Peloponnese and took it by the spear, and the Spartans were their purest descendants. The Spartans loved this version and dressed it in myth as the return of the descendants of Heracles, coming home to claim what was theirs. Modern archaeologists are far more cautious, because the ground tells a murkier tale. There is no single destruction layer, no clear trail of a conquering army. One possibility suggested by the evidence is something slower and stranger. Waves of migration, resettlement, and cultural change over generations. New Greek speakers with a Dorian dialect gradually becoming the dominant people of the valley. However they arrived. By around 900 BC, we can finally see them. 4 small villages stood together on low hills beside the Eurotas, near where the river bends past the foot of Taygetus. A 5th village nearby would later join them. Their names were Pitana, Messoa, Limnae, Kynosora, and later Amyclae. And individually they were nothing. Clusters of farmhouses in a fertile valley, indistinguishable from 100 other settlements in Greece. But these villages did something unusual. Instead of remaining rivals, they merged. Not physically. They never grew together into one dense walled town, but politically, into a single community with shared kings, shared gods, and a shared name. That community called itself Sparta, and here is the detail to keep, because it is the seed of everything to come. Classical Sparta famously lived without a continuous defensive wall. Nearly every other Greek polis wrapped itself in stone. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, all of them sheltered behind fortifications. For century after century, Sparta stood open in its valley, protected by the mountains at its back, and its people would boast by nothing else but men. A Spartan king, quoted much later by the writer Plutarch, supposedly pointed at his soldiers and said, "These are the walls of Sparta. Remember that boast. Remember it the way you remember a promise made in the first act of a play." This story runs for 700 more years, and there will come a time, far in the future, when the descendants of these villagers look at their open city and quietly change their minds. What they do then will tell you more about the truth of Sparta than every legend ever written about it. For now, though, in 900 BC, none of that is visible. Sparta is 5 villages of farmers in one of the best valleys in Greece. One small Dorian community among many, with good land, old ghosts, and no reason at all to become the strangest society in the ancient world. What changed them was not poverty. It was not invasion. It was a decision they made about the valley on the other side of the mountain. That decision is where our story truly begins. Chapter 2. The original sin conquering Messenia. Stand on the ridge of Taygetus, 8,000 feet above Sparta, and look west. Below you lies another valley. It is called Messenia, watered by its own river, the Pamisas, and if anything, it is even richer than the valley you just left. Softer, vida, more generous. An old verse preserved in the ancient sources describes Messenia as good to plough and good to plant. A phrase that sounds like an advertisement. And in a sense, it became one. Because on the eastern side of that mountain lived a growing community of Spartans. And they were looking west too. Here is the situation as the 8th century BC draws on. Sparta has united its villages. Its population is rising, all across Greece. Cities facing the same pressure are solving it the same way, by sending their surplus people overseas. Corinth plants colonies in Sicily. Miletus scatters settlements around the Black Sea. This is the safety valve of the Greek world. And it works. Sparta looked at that option, and looked at Messenia, and chose differently. Why sail 1,000 miles for new land, when there was a paradise 1 mountain away? The only inconvenience was that other Greeks already lived there. What followed is called the First Messenian War, fought in the late 8th century BC, somewhere around 735 to 715 BC. Though the chronology this early is genuinely uncertain, and historians treat the exact dates with caution, our sources for the war itself are thin and late. The fullest account was written by Pausanias, a travel writer working roughly 850 years after the fact, which is like relying on a book published today for the details of a war fought before Columbus sailed. What we can say with confidence is the outcome, after a long struggle, remembered in tradition as lasting 20 years. Sparta conquered the Messenian plain, and then Sparta did the thing that made it Sparta. When Greeks conquered other Greeks, there were customs. You might take tribute. You might install a friendly government. You might, in the harshest cases, destroy a city and sell its people. What you did not do was hold an entire Greek population in hereditary bondage, on their own land, generation after generation, indefinitely. That is what Sparta did. The conquered Messenians became Helots, joining an unfree population that already existed in Laconia itself. The word Helot probably means something like captives, and their condition needs care, because it was not slavery as the rest of Greece knew it, and its exact legal shape is still debated. A slave in Athens was private property, bought and sold as an individual. The Helots were different. They were not traded on the market like ordinary chattel slaves. They were bound to the land their families had always farmed, living in their own villages, with their own families and communities and memories, controlled through the Spartan system as a whole. While individual citizen households received their labor and a large share of everything they grew, the 7th century poet Tyrtaeus, a Spartan voice, and one of our only sources actually close to these events, described their condition in a line that survives. He wrote that they labored like donkeys worn down by heavy loads, forced to bring their masters half of all the fruit the soil bears. If you are watching this in America or Europe and reaching for a comparison, the nearest ones are medieval serfdom. And, in its hereditary extraction of labor from a conquered people, something that may remind you of plantation societies, though the institutions were not identical, and historians are careful with the analogy. What matters is the structural picture. A subject population, kept on the land, farming for a master class that lived elsewhere and, as we will see, never stopped being afraid of them. Some modern historians, including Paul Cartledge, have argued that Sparta is best understood less as a city that had slaves and more as a society organized around its unfree majority. Because now run the numbers. And the numbers are the heart of the story. The historian Herodotus, describing the Spartan army at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, records 7 Helots marching in support of every single Spartan citizen. Scholars debate how far that ratio held across the whole society. But every serious reconstruction points the same direction. The Spartans were massively, permanently outnumbered by the people they had subjugated. Tens of thousands of Messenians and Laconian Helots, held down by a citizen body that tradition and modern estimates alike suggest never much exceeded 8,000 or 9,000 adult men at its height. One honest note before we go on, because this number is going to follow us through the entire film. The ancient figures for Spartan citizens come from different kinds of evidence. A land division attributed to tradition here, a battlefield muster there, a philosopher's complaint somewhere else. They are approximate, and they should not be mistaken for a continuous census. But the direction, from thousands down toward hundreds, is among the most firmly established features of later Spartan history. So hold on to that first rough figure, 9,000, because we are going to watch it fall for the rest of this story. And when it finishes falling, Sparta as a great power ends. The Messenians never accepted their fate. Around 2 generations after the conquest, in the middle of the 7th century BC, they rose in a massive revolt, a struggle so serious that tradition remembers it as the Second Messenian War. The details are wrapped in legend, but the scale of the crisis is not. Tyrtaeus wrote his war poems during this struggle, verses urging Spartan men to stand firm in the line, to bite the lip and hold. And those poems read less like the anthems of a confident master race and more like the urgent propaganda of a state fighting for its life. Sparta won in the end, and the rebellion was crushed. And in the aftermath, the Spartans faced the true consequence of their original decision. They now held a conquered nation that had proven it would rise the moment it saw weakness. They could not release the Helots, because the entire economy stood on their backs. They could not remove them, for the same reason. What the Spartans chose instead, gradually, over generations whose exact sequence historians still argue about, was to change themselves. If the Helots could never be safely freed, then the masters could never be safely relaxed. Here is the reading this film will follow, and it is fair to tell you plainly that it is a reading, though one with strong ancient support, whatever other purposes it later served. And it served many. Glory, competition among Greek states, the defense of the valley. The Spartan system was shaped above all by one permanent condition: the much larger unfree population underneath it. Thucydides himself, one of the most careful minds of the ancient world, wrote that most Spartan institutions had always been designed with a view to security against the Helots. When the famous military state finally emerges into the light of history, it emerges holding someone else's valley. And everything strange about it makes the most sense when you remember that. The Greeks had a story shape for this, a choice made in ambition, whose consequences unfold across generations until they close over the one who chose. They called it tragedy. Sparta set its own in motion in the 8th century BC, in someone else's valley. Every chapter that follows, the strange laws, the raised children, the night patrols, the glory at the pass, and the long fading at the end, grows from this root. But a society cannot reorganize itself around a permanent garrison by accident. It needs a design, a law, a story about itself. And the Spartans had exactly that. They said their whole way of life was the gift of one man, a lawgiver whose name still echoes in political philosophy today. There is just one problem with him. he may never have existed. Chapter 3. Lycurgus and the Machine. Start with the problem, because the problem explains everything that follows. Imagine you are a Spartan leader in the 7th century BC. In the years after the Great Messenian Revolt, you have just barely survived a war against your own workforce. You rule 2 valleys now, and in one of them, every farmhouse holds a family that remembers being free and prays for your ruin. Your fellow citizens are farmers and part-time soldiers, quarreling over land and status like Greeks everywhere. And you know, with the cold certainty of a man who has seen the passes at night, that the next revolt is not a question of if. What do you do? Other Greek states in crisis wrote new law codes, redistributed some land, exiled a few aristocrats. Sparta's answer had pieces of all that, but welded together into something no other Greek city attempted. In effect, Sparta answered the question, how do we hold Messenia forever? With a second question that should stop you cold. What if the city itself became the garrison? Not an army raised in emergencies. A society that was an army. All the time. By design. The Spartans told a simpler story about where this came from. They said it was the work of one man, Lycurgus. The tales about him are wonderful. A royal prince who refused a throne. A traveller who studied the laws of Crete and Ionia. Some said, even Egypt. A man who consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi and was greeted with words no Greek forgot. That the god was uncertain whether to call him a man or a god, but rather thought a god. He gave Sparta its complete system of law, made the citizens swear to change nothing until he returned, then walked out of the city and starved himself to death so that he never would. Sparta, bound by its oath to a dead man, kept his system for centuries. Now, here is what a careful storyteller owes you. Our main source for Lycurgus is Plutarch, writing around 100 AD, roughly 700 to 800 years after Lycurgus supposedly lived, and Plutarch himself, in the very first lines of his biography, throws up his hands, writing that nothing whatsoever can be said about Lycurgus that is not disputed, not his ancestry, not his travels, not even the century he lived in. Many modern historians, including specialists like Stephen Hodkinson, doubt there was a single lawgiver at all. The system was more likely assembled in layers, mostly in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, in the long shadow of the Messenian Wars, and then projected backward onto a founding hero, because every ancient people preferred a divine origin story to a messy political one. So treat Lycurgus as a legend wrapped around something real. The man is uncertain. The system credited to him was absolutely real, described in detail by writers like Xenophon, an Athenian who admired Sparta and knew its society closely, and Aristotle, who studied it critically. These institutions did not necessarily emerge at once or from a single plan, but together they eventually formed a remarkably coherent system. And the clearest way to understand that system is to watch each piece answer a problem. The garrison could not survive, leaving unsolved. Problem 1. A state at permanent war cannot afford succession crises. Sparta's answer was to keep not one king, but 2, drawn from 2 separate royal families, ruling simultaneously, forever. It sounds unworkable, and sometimes it was. But notice the logic. 2 kings check each other. When one commanded the army abroad, the other remained home, and there was always a home to guard. Sparta looked at monarchy, the single point of failure of the ancient world, and engineered a backup into it. Problem 2. Kings and citizens alike can act rashly, and a garrison state cannot afford rashness. So alongside the kings sat the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, plus the 2 kings. Every member at least 60 years old, serving for life, shaping every proposal before the citizen assembly ever heard it. The assembly of citizen men could vote yes or no by shouting, and tradition held that the elders could simply set aside a vote that went the wrong way. And watching everyone, including the kings, stood 5 officials called ephors, elected annually, with powers that should astonish you. The ephors could fine anyone. They could arrest and prosecute the kings themselves. Each month, kings and ephors exchanged oaths, the kings swearing to rule according to the laws, the ephors swearing to uphold the kings only if they did. Ancient thinkers were fascinated by this design. It was neither monarchy, nor aristocracy, nor democracy, but a deliberate blend, each element restraining the others. Aristotle analyzed it. The historian Polybius later praised Rome's balanced constitution in terms shaped by the Spartan example, and the thread runs on toward the present. The founders of the American Republic read their Plutarch and their classical political theory closely. John Adams discussed the Spartan constitution in his writings on government, and the broad idea that liberty survives only when power is divided against itself owes something real, alongside many other influences, to the example first argued over in the Eurotas Valley. That is the part of the design the world came to admire. Now look at the parts it should not have, because the same design, in the same breath, was built to dissolve the individual into the garrison. Problem 3. Soldiers, distracted by wealth and family, make unreliable garrison troops. Sparta's answers here are the ones that made it famous and strange. Citizens were supported by allotments of land worked by Helots, and were barred from farming and from practicing trades. Tradition says the lawgiver banned gold and silver outright, leaving Sparta with iron money, deliberately heavy, deliberately worthless, so that a bribe would require a wheelbarrow. Modern scholars note that Sparta simply did not coin money in this era, like some other early states, and that the iron money story grew in the telling. Note also, and remember it, that wealth differences among Spartans never actually disappeared. They went quiet, and centuries later they will come back at the worst possible moment. And then the institution that held the whole thing together. And to see it properly, let the sources take us inside for a moment. Picture an evening in classical Sparta, as Xenophon and Plutarch describe the custom. In a long, plain hall, 15 or so men recline around a common table. They are not family. They are a syssition, a dining group, and every citizen man of Sparta belongs to one, elected into it by the existing members, paying dues of barley, wine, cheese, and figs from his allotment. The famous dish is the black broth, pork cooked in blood and vinegar, which the rest of Greece considered proof in itself of Spartan indifference to pleasure. There is a story, told by Plutarch, of a king of Pontus who hired a Spartan cook to make him this broth, tasted it, and spat it out, and was told that the seasoning was missing. The broth is only good after a plunge in the Eurotas. Around these tables sit young and old together. The talk is watched, and the boys who serve are questioned and tested. A man dines here, by law and custom, nearly every night of his adult life. Miss your dues, and you are not merely dropped from a dinner club, you lose your citizenship. Understand what that room was doing. It welded a man's loyalty to his messmates, the men beside whom he would also stand in battle, and it quietly loosened every competing loyalty, to household, to wealth, to private life. The dining hall was the garrison state in miniature, renewed every single evening. The citizens produced by this system called themselves homoioi. The word means the equals, or the similars, and it is the most honest word Sparta ever used about itself, because it contains both the dream and the omission. The dream: thousands of men, alike in dress, in food, in training, a brotherhood without visible rich or poor. The omission: that this equality rested on everyone it excluded. The Helots, who fed it. The free provincial communities, called perioikoi, who traded and manufactured for it. And the women who, as we will see, ended up holding much of the land that made it all run. The equals were a small, armed elite balanced on a much larger world of the unequal. A garrison that had learned to describe itself as a country. Xenophon, the admirer, looked at all this and called Sparta the only state where being good was a full-time occupation. Aristotle, the analyst, looked at the same design and delivered a colder verdict. Sparta, he wrote, had organized itself toward one virtue only, the virtue useful for war. And a state built for war alone does not know how to live at peace. Keep Aristotle's warning in your pocket. Near the end of this story, it will read less like analysis than prophecy. But no constitution, no dining hall, no iron money could by itself produce the men this system required. For that, the design reached further than any Greek state had ever reached, into childhood itself. Because Sparta did not recruit its soldiers, it raised them, from the age of 7, in the most famous school in the ancient world. And the school is where the legend and the evidence begin to pull hard against each other. Chapter 4. Raised by the state, the Agoge. The sources do not preserve the exact morning, and no ancient writer recorded the ceremony, if there was one. But at roughly the age of 7, a Spartan citizen boy left the world of his mother's household and entered the system, later writers called the Agoge, and from that point until manhood, the state of Sparta, not his family, set the shape of his days. His family did not vanish from his life. He still had kin, a name, a future household, a place at his father's mess as a visitor, but his upbringing now belonged to the city, and no other Greek state did anything like it. The word agoge is usually translated as the raising, or the upbringing, and Greeks used related words for the raising of animals, which tells you something about the spirit of the thing. Our best descriptions come from Xenophon, who admired Sparta and knew its society closely, and from Plutarch, writing centuries later, mixing solid information with polished legend. One caution belongs at the front. Much of what we know describes the system as it stood in the classical period and after, and how early it took this full shape, and how much later writers idealized it, are open questions. What follows is the picture the sources give, flagged where it grows uncertain. The boys were organized into herds, and that is the actual term the sources use. Herds, under older youths and under an official whose title meant something like the boy herdsman, who carried a whip. They slept in groups, on beds of reeds. They cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas, by hand. Without knives, they went barefoot in all seasons, because bare feet, Xenophon explains, climb and run and grip better than shod ones. They wore a single cloak through the year, summer and winter, to teach the body indifference to weather, and they were kept deliberately underfed, not starved into weakness, but held permanently hungry, on rations set too small. And here is the detail that tells you this was design rather than simple cruelty. The hungry boys were expected to steal food, sneak into gardens, raid the men's messes, take what they could. But a boy who was caught was whipped severely. And Xenophon is explicit about the logic. The punishment was not for stealing. It was for stealing badly. Endurance, cunning, self-control under hunger, the ability to move unseen. These were the qualities the system rewarded. Hold on to that curriculum of sanctioned stealth, because in the next chapter, we will meet the institution that some ancient writers and some modern historians believe it fed into, and the connection, if it is real, is one of the darkest in Greek history. Plutarch preserves the most famous story of that stealth. A boy, he says, had stolen a fox cub and hidden it under his cloak, and when he was stopped and questioned, he stood still and let the animal claw and bite through his belly rather than reveal it, and died. Did that happen? Plutarch wrote hundreds of years after the era he describes, and the tale has the smooth shape of a parable. So, historians treat it as legend rather than record. But legend is still evidence of something. It shows what Spartans wanted boys to believe was admirable, and what they wanted the world to believe about Spartan boys. The daily training was not what the movies suggest. Hollywood shows small children dueling with swords. The sources describe something broader and, in its way, more revealing. Physical conditioning above all. Running, wrestling, swimming in the Eurotas, choral song and dance. Because Sparta was famous across Greece for its choirs and festivals, and moving in time with others, in a culture of massed spears, was never only art, competition in everything, watched and judged by elders, obedience drilled into reflex, reading and writing were taught. Plutarch says, only as much as necessary, and speech itself was trained. In the direction of compression, boys spent evenings at the men's messes being questioned, expected to answer well or not at all. In the clipped style the Greeks named after this very region, Laconia gave the world the word laconic. When a boy answered a long question with 3 perfect words, that was the system working as intended. Formal weapons training, interestingly, appears surprisingly late and lightly in the sources. What the Agoge manufactured first was not swordsmanship. It was the habit of enduring, obeying, and holding a place in a group, the raw material of the phalanx and of the garrison life beyond it. Now we have to talk about the cliff, the most notorious claim about Sparta, repeated in 1,000 documentaries, is that elders inspected every newborn, and that infants judged weak or deformed were thrown from a gorge on Mount Taygetus, at a place called the Apathete, the dumping ground. The source, once again, is Plutarch, writing centuries later. So what does the physical evidence say? In 2007, a Greek research team led by the anthropologist Theodoros Pitzios published results from the gorge traditionally identified with the site. The human remains recovered there belonged overwhelmingly to adolescents and adult men, consistent with ancient reports that Sparta threw criminals, traitors, and prisoners into the gorge. Among all those bones, the team reported finding no infants at all. That does not close the case. Plutarch does describe infant inspection, and the quiet abandonment of unwanted newborns was a widespread practice across the ancient world, including democratic Athens. So Sparta would hardly need to be innocent of it. But the specific, spectacular image, a state machine hurling babies from a cliff, rests on one late source and is contradicted by the bones we actually have. A careful verdict sounds like this. Sparta judged its newborns in some fashion, and Sparta was capable of harshness. We will see with our own eyes elsewhere. But the baby-throwing gorge, as popularly imagined, is probably a myth that grew in the telling. Notice the pattern, because it will repeat all the way to Hollywood. The real Sparta keeps turning out to be less theatrical, and in quieter ways more unsettling than the legend. Why more unsettling? Follow the boy to the end of the pipeline. At 20, he became a soldier and stood for election to a mess. Until 30, he lived with his unit. Even if he married, and the sources say a young husband visited his own wife only by slipping away at night. So that, Plutarch remarks, a man might father children before he ever saw his wife's face in daylight. At 30, he became a full citizen, one of the equals, entitled at last to a household, and he remained under arms, dining with his mess, liable for service, until 60. Added up, from 7 to 60, a Spartan man's life ran on the state's rails, and the state had one use for him. Xenophon presents this as the secret of Spartan excellence, and by the narrow measure of producing steady, disciplined infantry, it worked. Spartan formations maneuvered calmly where other Greek militias dissolved into shoving crowds. Thucydides describes enemies unnerved by the slow, silent, flute-paced Spartan advance, an army walking into battle to music. At exactly the moment every other army in Greece was screaming. But here is this chapter's judgment, offered as judgment, and it cuts against 3 centuries of admiration. The Agoge did not produce supermen, it produced specialists, and the specialty was narrower than advertised. It manufactured obedience far more reliably than it manufactured judgment, cut loose from the system. Abroad, with money and power in reach, Spartan commanders became famous across Greece for exactly the vices the upbringing was supposed to make impossible: corruption and high-handedness. And several of Sparta's worst disasters ahead will come from precisely this flaw. A school that teaches men to follow rules prepares them poorly for the day. There are no rules watching. And one more thing. The thing the legend hides in plain sight. All of this machinery, the herds, the hunger, the whips, the sanctioned stealth, existed inside the situation we built in Chapter 2. A few thousand equals, holding 2 valleys, one of which prayed nightly for their ruin. The Agoge was not preparing boys for Thermopylae. No one in 7th century Sparta had heard of Persia. It was preparing them for the life of a permanent garrison, in a countryside that could never be fully trusted. And for some of its graduates, according to our sources, the state had a further assignment. Not a place in the line, something quieter, out in the hills, in the dark. What exactly that assignment was, even the ancient writers could not fully agree, which is itself part of the story. Chapter 5. The Hidden Ones Helots and the Krypteia begin with the fact that no one disputes, because it anchors everything else. Sparta's citizens lived, by law, off the labor of others, barred from farming and trades. Every equal was fed by Helot families, working his allotment in Laconia and Messenia. Herodotus, counting the army at Plataea, records 7 Helots attending each Spartan citizen, and whatever the exact ratio across the whole society, every ancient source agrees the Helots vastly outnumbered their masters. Thucydides states plainly that most Spartan institutions had always been designed with a view to security against them. Not against Persia, not against Athens, against the people who grew their food. Because the Helots were not broken, and the Spartans knew it. These were Greeks, above all, the Messenians, who remembered being free, kept their families and villages and language, and passed their grievance down like an inheritance. The Athenian writer Critias observed that in Sparta, the free were the most free of men, and the unfree the most unfree, 2 extremes produced by a single system. each defining the other. And the fear ran both ways. Aristotle wrote that the Helots sat like an enemy in ambush, perpetually waiting for Spartan disaster. He was not being poetic. Twice in this story, when disaster comes, the Helots will rise within days. How does a small masterclass govern a hostile majority for 3 centuries? The sources describe a set of instruments, and here the evidence needs handling piece by piece. Because this is where legend, hostile rumor, and fact are hardest to separate. And a film that promised you the evidence owes you the seams. The first instrument is reported by Aristotle, whose account of Spartan institutions survives through Plutarch. Each year, he says, the incoming ephors formally declared war on the Helots, so that killing one would carry no religious pollution. If the report is accurate, and most historians take it seriously while noting we have it second-hand, then Sparta had built a legal frame in which violence against its own workforce was sanctioned in advance, renewed annually, as routine as the other proclamation tradition assigns to the ephors, an order to the citizens to shave the mustache and obey the laws, housekeeping and war. In the same breath, the second instrument is the one that has haunted readers for 2,000 years. It was called the Krypteia, from the Greek for hidden. And here our 2 main witnesses do not tell the same story. Plato, in the 4th century BC, has a Spartan character describe the Krypteia as a training in endurance. Young men sent out to live rough in the countryside, barefoot in winter, without servants, wandering by night. An ordeal. In his telling, a test, Plutarch, writing 5 centuries later, describes something else. Magistrates periodically selected the most capable young men and sent them into the countryside with daggers and basic rations. By day, they hid. By night, he writes, they came down to the roads and killed any Helot they caught. And they went through the fields, killing the strongest of the Helots deliberately. Not random violence. Selection. And Plutarch adds that he cannot believe the founding lawgiver invented anything so foul, and insists it must have been a later corruption, which tells you that even Sparta's ancient admirers flinched at what they had heard. So what was the Krypteia? An initiation ordeal, a rural patrol, an instrument of terror against the Helots, or some combination that shifted over time? The honest answer is that the sources are late, partial, and intention, and modern historians still argue across that gap. Some read the sanctioned stealth of the Agoge, the stealing, the night movement, as the natural apprenticeship for the version Plutarch describes, and the inference is reasonable, but it is an inference. And this film will not dress it as a record. What can be said with confidence is narrower and still chilling. Sparta maintained institutions whose purpose was the surveillance and intimidation of its unfree population. Ancient writers connected its most select young men to that work, and the version of the Krypteia that circulated in antiquity was dark enough that Sparta's own defenders tried to explain it away. The third piece of evidence is not an institution, but an event, and it comes from one of the most rigorous historians antiquity produced. During the Great War with Athens, around 425 to 424 BC, with Helot restlessness rising, Thucydides reports that the Spartans made an announcement. Helots, who had rendered the best service in war, should come forward and be judged, for they would be freed. Picture what happens in the villages when that word arrives. Men step forward, and by the nature of the offer, they are the bravest, the proven, the natural leaders. About 2,000 were selected. They were crowned with garlands and led around the temples as free men. And then, Thucydides writes, the Spartans made away with them, and no one ever knew how each of them was destroyed. 2,000 men, gone, The historian records it in almost administrative language. And the phrase, "no one ever knew," may be the most frightening part, because it means the best informed man in Greece could not discover the method. The announcement of freedom, in his telling, had been the instrument, designed to make the most dangerous men identify themselves. Scholarly honesty requires noting that this episode rests on Thucydides alone, that its scale and total secrecy have led a minority of scholars to question its details, and that he reports it briefly, without naming his source, but he was a contemporary, generally rated among the most careful reporters of his age, and he states it as fact. If it happened as written, it is among the coldest recorded acts of any Greek state. Now step back and look at the whole picture. Uncertainties and all, a formal annual declaration against the workforce, reported second-hand from Aristotle, a hidden institution, described as an ordeal by one source and as selective killing by another, a recorded mass disappearance from a first-rate contemporary. However you weigh each piece, they point one direction. The legend says Sparta was a warrior society, and it was, but the war it was organized around, day to day, was not against Persia or Athens. It was the quiet, permanent business of holding Messenia, and much of the famous army's existence remained tied to security at home rather than glory abroad. Modern historians like Paul Cartledge have argued that fear of the Helots is the single key that best unlocks Spartan behavior across 3 centuries, including behavior that otherwise looks bizarre. And in the chapters ahead, you will watch that key turn again and again. Why did Sparta so rarely campaign far from home? Why did its kings keep abandoning wars to march back? You now know what they were marching back to guard. And here is the thought to carry out of this chapter. When later admirers across the centuries praised Spartan freedom, discipline, and equality, they were praising the internal arrangements of a masterclass, a community of equals that existed because a much larger community of the unequal fed it under compulsion. That does not erase what was genuinely remarkable in Sparta. It reframes it. The courage was real, and so was the fear underneath it. The discipline was real, and so was the organized threat that made it feel necessary. But there was one group inside the citizen class that this system treated in a way that startled the rest of Greece in the opposite direction. While Athens kept its citizen women indoors and unnamed, the women of Sparta's citizen families owned land, spoke their minds in public, trained in the open air, and eventually, by Aristotle's own irritated count, held 2/5 of the country in their hands. The most rigid state in Greece turned out to be, for a woman born into its elite, the freest place in the Greek world to be one. That paradox is our next chapter. Chapter 6. The women Sparta didn't expect you to meet. Tradition preserves a question put to Gorgo, Queen of Sparta, wife of King Leonidas, a foreign woman, in most versions an Athenian, asked her why Spartan women were the only women in Greece who could rule men. Gorgo's answer, as Plutarch records it, is 5 words in English: because we are the only women who give birth to men. Set aside the swagger for a moment and hear what the exchange assumes. Because every Greek who repeated it agreed on the premise. The women of Sparta's citizen class were unlike other Greek women. Louder, freer, richer, more visible. To feel how strange that was, you need the comparison the ancient world itself always reached for. The city that will soon become Sparta's great rival. An Athenian woman of citizen family lived, ideally, unseen, married in her mid-teens to a man perhaps twice her age, unable to own meaningful property in her own right, voiceless in court, Respectable custom held that she stayed indoors and out of talk so completely that an Athenian orator could praise womanhood by saying, "The greatest glory belongs to her who is least talked about among men," whether for good or ill. One honest caution here. That is the ideal preserved in elite male writing, in legal speeches and philosophy, and the daily economic life of ordinary Athenian women. Working women, market women, was certainly messier and freer than the ideal admits. But the ideal was real. It shaped law and marriage and property, and no Athenian writer ever mistook his city's women for Sparta's. Now cross the Peloponnese and walk into the Eurotas Valley. Spartan girls of citizen family received a level of organized public physical education unusual, perhaps unparalleled. In the Greek world, the sources, Xenophon and Plutarch above all, describe girls running, wrestling, throwing the discus and the javelin, training in the open where anyone could watch, in short tunics that scandalized the rest of Greece. Other Greeks had a mocking nickname for them, thigh flashers, and the poet Ibycus used it as an insult. Sparta did not care, and Xenophon explains why, in the plainest terms. The system held that strong. Healthy mothers bear strong. Healthy children. Notice that the reasoning is not liberation. It is the same breeding logic that ran the Agoge, pointed at daughters. But notice also the practical result, because results have a way of outrunning intentions. While Athenian girls were being trained in invisibility, Spartan girls were being trained in strength. In public, with the state's approval, they married later, too. And this detail matters more than it sounds. Athenian girls commonly married around 14 or 15. Plutarch reports that Spartan women married in their physical prime, their late teens or around 20, to men close to their own age. And Greek observers already connected earlier marriage with greater danger in childbirth. A Spartan bride entered marriage as something closer to an adult partner than a transferred child. And because of the system you already know, the marriage itself was unlike marriage anywhere else in Greece. Recall the Agoge. A Spartan husband under 30 lived with his unit and visited his wife by night. A husband over 30 dined with his mess every evening until old age, which means the Spartan household, its land, its Helot laborers, its stores, its daily decisions, ran under the direction of its woman, not as an emergency measure, but as the ordinary condition of life. Decade after decade. Now follow the property, because the property is where this chapter stops being charming and becomes historically explosive. Women of the Spartan citizen class could inherit and hold land in their own right, a capacity their Athenian counterparts essentially lacked. Herodotus tells of a Spartan heiress whose hand and fortune kings schemed over, and by the 4th century BC, the results had compounded into something no one had planned. Aristotle, in his Politics, reports with open disapproval that women held some 2/5 of all the land in Sparta, 40% of the most militarized state in Greece, in the hands of its women. Aristotle blamed this, along with what he called female license, for Sparta's troubles, complaining that the lawgiver had disciplined the men and given up on the women, and that in daily life, the men were ruled by them. Modern historians read the same facts differently, and the difference is instructive. Where Aristotle saw corruption, scholars like Paul Cartledge and Sarah Pomeroy, whose book Spartan Women remains the standard study, see structure, a society that kept every man in barracks and mess halls for most of his life had, without ever intending it, produced some of the most economically autonomous women in the Greek world. The system built to produce soldiers quietly produced heiresses, Hold on to Aristotle's 2/5 and his irritation. Because near the end of this story, when we ask why Sparta ran out of citizens, land concentrating in fewer and fewer hands will be one of the gears of the collapse. The chapter that startled Greece and the chapter that ends Sparta are the same chapter, seen from two distances. Honesty requires the boundaries of all this, and they are sharp. This freedom belonged to the citizen elite. A Helot woman shared none of it, and her daughters inherited her bondage. The women of the Perioikoi, the free provincial towns, lived ordinary Greek lives outside the charmed circle. Even for citizen women, the freedom was a role inside the same design, honored because it produced soldiers. Plutarch records the tradition that only certain dead received named graves in Sparta, men who fell in battle, and women who died, depending on how the text is read. In childbirth or in sacred office, the battlefield and the birthing room counted as the same front, and Spartan mothers were expected to enforce the code at home. Plutarch collected their recorded sayings, and the most famous is the farewell attributed to a mother handing her son his shield. "Come back with it," or "on it." We cannot verify a single one of these lines, and the collection was polished for centuries before it reached us. But the genre itself is evidence. Greeks found such words believable of Spartan women, specifically. No one collected the sayings of Athenian mothers. So here is this chapter's verdict, and it is a double one. Sparta offers one of history's strangest lessons in unintended consequences. The most rigid, most controlled society in Greece produced, as a side effect of its own obsessions, the freest citizen women in the Greek world, while democratic Athens, the civilization we claim as our political ancestor, kept its citizen women behind doors. If that unsettles the neat story of Sparta as pure darkness and Athens as pure light, good. Real history refuses those scripts, and one Spartan woman stands at the hinge of the whole story. So let her step forward properly before the armies march. Gorgo was royal twice over, daughter of King Cleomenes, wife of King Leonidas, and Herodotus, who rarely pauses for anyone, pauses for her twice. Once as a child of 8 or 9, standing beside her father when a foreign envoy tried to buy Sparta's army with escalating offers of money. And, the historian says, it was the child who spoke, telling her father to get up and leave before the stranger corrupted him. And once as an adult, when a wooden writing tablet arrived in Sparta, apparently blank, and the officials were baffled until Gorgo, Herodotus reports, saw what no man had, that the wax should be scraped away to find the message cut into the wood beneath. Whether these stories are polished, we cannot know. That Herodotus chose to preserve them. About a woman, in a book about wars, tells you what Greece itself believed about the minds of Spartan women. The message hidden under that wax was a warning, sent from deep inside the Persian Empire by an exiled Spartan king. It said the great king was coming. Her husband was Leonidas. The pass where he would meet that king was called the Hot Gates. And what actually happened there is both less and more than the movie you have seen. Chapter 7. Thermopylae. The battle versus the movie. 40 minutes ago, this film made you a promise. Not the legend. The evidence. No chapter tests that promise like this one. Because no event in Spartan history, perhaps in all ancient history, carries more legend per square foot than the pass we are about to enter. So hold the promise, and hold everything you now know. The Helots, the arithmetic, the system built for a different war. And let's find out what is actually underneath the most famous last stand in the world. In 480 BC, one of the largest invasion forces the Greek world had ever seen, crossed from Asia into Europe on 2 bridges made of boats. Herodotus, our chief source for all of it, claims the Persian king Xerxes led over 2 million fighting men. No modern historian accepts that figure. Reconstructions built from supply, water, and road capacity mostly land somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 soldiers, with many scholars favoring the lower end. Plus, a fleet of hundreds of warships. Take the lowest estimate, and it remains, for its era, staggering. A moving city, drinking rivers low, marching to fold the quarrelsome little cities of Greece into an empire that already stretched from India to Egypt. Against this, the Greek world did something it almost never did. Dozens of cities, anciennes rivales, formed an alliance, and they gave the supreme command, on land and at sea, to Sparta. That single fact tells you what Sparta's reputation was worth in 480 BC, 60 years before anyone outside Greece had reason to doubt it. The strategy was geography. Northern Greece could not be held, but at a place called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for its sulfur springs. The mountains squeezed the coastal road into a corridor so narrow that numbers would stop mattering, block the pass, and the Persian multitude becomes a crowd stuck in a doorway, while the allied fleet held the Strait of Artemisium alongside. So the army could not simply be ferried around. It was a sound plan. What happened to it created the most durable war story in Western memory, and also one of its most edited. So let us do this carefully, claim by claim. Movie against sources. First claim. The 300. It is true. Leonidas marched north with a picked royal guard of 300 Spartan citizens. All, Herodotus notes, men with living sons, so that no family line would end in the pass. What is not true is that they stood alone. Herodotus himself lists the allied contingents, and though ancient figures never add up perfectly, the conventional total from his numbers is roughly 7,000 Greeks holding the pass, including 700 men from the small city of Thespiae, 400 from Thebes, and thousands more from cities most people have never heard of. And even the Spartan contribution was larger than the brand. Herodotus records Helot attendants present at Thermopylae, and among the dead, the unfree were in the pass too. The movie has no frame for them. After 5 chapters, you do. Second claim. The fighting. Here, remarkably, the record needs no inflation. For 2 full days, the Greek line held the narrows against everything Xerxes sent. The corridor cancelled Persian numbers and cavalry, and in close combat, the difference in armor, spear length, and drill was brutal. Herodotus describes the Spartans fighting with professional coolness among militias, at one point feigning retreat to pull the Persians forward, then wheeling in order to destroy them. Xerxes committed the immortals, his 10,000-man elite guard. They failed too. The king, Herodotus writes, leapt 3 times from his seat in fear for his army. Third claim. The betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes, hoping for reward, told Xerxes of a mountain track that circled behind the pass. Herodotus names him without hesitation as the one who bears the guilt, and his name became, and remains, a Greek word for nightmare. The immortals walked the path overnight. The men guarding it were brushed aside. By dawn on the 3rd day, Leonidas knew the position was turned. Now comes the decision that made the legend, and it deserves to be told straight. Leonidas dismissed most of the army, several thousand men, who withdrew to fight later. He stayed with the 300 And here is what the movie erases most completely. The 700 Thespians stayed too, by their own choice, to the last man, a sacrifice that, measured against the size of their small city, arguably exceeded Sparta's. The 400 Thebans stayed. Though Herodotus questions how willingly, the Helot attendants stayed, and no one recorded whether anyone asked them. Why did Leonidas stay at all? Herodotus offers layered motives, and honesty keeps all of them. Honor, because Spartan law and custom forbade abandoning a post. Strategy, a rear guard to cover the withdrawal. And prophecy, an oracle from Delphi, declaring that either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king must die. Modern historians still weigh those three against each other. What no source doubts is that the choice was deliberate, made in the open, with a night to think about it. The final morning was not a battle, but an ending. The defenders pushed out into the wider part of the pass to sell themselves dearly, fought with spears until the spears broke. Herodotus says, then with swords, then around the body of the fallen Leonidas, with hands and teeth, until the arrows finished it from all sides. 2 lines survive from the tradition around that morning, both preserved by Herodotus. Before the fighting, told that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, the Spartan Dieneces supposedly replied, "Good. Then we will fight in the shade, and over the graves afterward." Verses attributed to the poet Simonides were set in stone. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their words, we lie. So, did it matter? You deserve the argument, not just the trumpet call. The hard reading, says Thermopylae, was a defeat that bought perhaps a week, that Athens burned regardless, and that Greece was actually saved by the fleet at Salamis later that year and by the great land battle the year after. The generous reading, favored by Herodotus himself, says the delay, let the fleet fight at Artemisium and withdraw intact, and that the story became a weapon in its own right. Proof to a terrified Greece that the great king's army could be fought, purchased at a price that made surrender shameful. Both readings are serious. What is not serious is the version where 300 men nearly beat an empire alone. And now, the real twist of this chapter, the one that reframes everything after it. Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The pass fell, and yet it became the most famous battle in Western history, eclipsing the victories that actually won the war. How? Not, as far as the evidence shows, through some deliberate Spartan propaganda office. Herodotus, remember, is the one who preserved the allied numbers. The Thespians, the Helots, all of it. The editing happened the way memory edits. Sparta honored its 300. Poets sharpened the story. Later writers repeated the sharpest version. And over centuries the memory compressed thousands of defenders into a single, unforgettable number. Every retelling shaved away another complication, until a coalition's desperate rear-guard action became 300 supermen. Alone, by the time Hollywood arrived, the compression was 24 centuries deep, and the movie only finished what memory had started. The Thespians waited a long time for theirs. A modern monument to the 700 was finally raised at Thermopylae in 1997, beside the memorial to Leonidas. 24 centuries late. But memory does not stop an empire. The Persian army was still in Greece. Athens was ash, and everything now depended on what the alliance did next. The following year, on a plain called Krypteia, Sparta would fight the largest land battle of the war, the one that actually broke the invasion, the greatest victory in its history. You have probably never heard of it. That silence, and what Sparta did with a victory it never learned to tell, is where we turn now. Chapter 8. The Golden Decade and the Rival. 1 year after Thermopylae. In the summer of 479 BC, one of the largest Greek armies, the sources record, stood on a plain near a small town called Plataea, and at the center of its line stood Sparta. Herodotus gives the numbers. And as always, with ancient numbers, treat them as the shape of the thing rather than a census. Nearly 40,000 Greek heavy infantry from more than 20 cities, and among them 5,000 Spartan citizens, the largest force of the equals ever recorded in the field. Each attended, he says, by 7 Helots. Do the arithmetic this story has taught you to do. Tens of thousands of unfree men marched out to support their masters in a war being fought. The alliance said, for Greek freedom, ancient history rarely offers a heavier irony, and no one in the Greek camp seems to have written it down. Across the plain waited the Persian army Xerxes had left behind under his best general, Mardonius, when the king himself withdrew after the naval disaster at Salamis. What followed was messy, as real battles are: days of standoff, cavalry raids, fouled springs, a confused Greek night withdrawal that left the army scattered at dawn. Mardonius, believing the Spartans were fleeing, threw his forces forward. It was the mistake of the war. On broken ground, with cavalry blunted, the fight became exactly the kind of close, grinding infantry battle that Spartan training existed for. Herodotus writes that the Persians were not inferior in courage, but they fought in lighter armor, with shorter spears, in looser order, and it was not enough. The Spartan line broke them. Mardonius died fighting. The Persian camp was stormed, and with it, the immediate Persian attempt to conquer mainland Greece was broken. The wider war would smolder on for decades in the Aegean and Asia, but no great king's army ever marched on Greece again. Here, then, is a puzzle worth stating plainly. Plataea was the greatest land victory in Spartan history, and one of the decisive battles of the ancient world, and almost no one today has heard of it. There is no Plataea movie. A defeat at a mountain pass became immortal, and the victory that avenged it became a footnote, which tells you something uncomfortable about how memory works. Victory, it turns out, makes worse legend than sacrifice. Keep that in mind. Whenever anyone tells you history remembers what mattered most, history remembers what tells best. Sparta now stood at the summit of the Greek world, and what it did next tells you everything about the state we have spent 7 chapters assembling. It went home. Within a few years, Sparta had walked away from leadership of the ongoing sea war against Persia. Part of the reason wore a name: Pausanias, the regent who had commanded at Plataea, who took to parading in Persian dress, opened suspicious correspondence with the great king's court, and ended his life walled up in a temple in Sparta, starved by his own government. Remember the flaw the upbringing stamped into its graduates: discipline at home, and no preparation at all for power abroad. Pausanias is the first great specimen. He will not be the last. But the deeper reason Sparta went home is the one you already know. Its leadership could never separate overseas command from the risk in Messenia. Every year abroad was a year of exposure in the valley behind the mountain. So Sparta withdrew into the Peloponnese, and into the vacuum stepped the city whose fleet had won Salamis. Athens organized the maritime cities into a new alliance against Persia, headquartered on the sacred island of Delos, and historians call it the Delian League. Within a generation, member cities that tried to leave were being besieged and forced back, their ship contributions converted to cash tribute paid to Athens. Thucydides, the Athenian historian who guides us from here, describes the change without flinching. The League had become an empire. So the Greek world settled into two systems. And the contrast could not have been sharper. Athens, a naval empire, democratic, commercial, loud, rebuilding itself in marble. Sparta, a land power, closed, silent, deliberately changeless, guarding its two valleys, two Greeces, watching each other across the isthmus. Then, in 464 BC, the ground itself moved. An earthquake struck Laconia, and the ancient accounts describe devastation on a scale Greece had rarely known. Later, writers report the town of Sparta left in ruins and enormous casualties, including, one tradition says, boys of the Agoge crushed in their training hall. Those figures come from late sources and cannot be verified. And we say so. What happened next, though, is in Thucydides, and it is the hinge of this chapter. The Helots rose. 3. For a moment, to stand in a Messenian village in the days after the news arrives. The sources preserve no Helots' words, so we cannot pretend to quote one. But we can name what they would have heard. The master's town was damaged, badly, and rumors of enormous casualties were spreading through the countryside. For 3 centuries, the one fixed fact of life had been that Sparta was strong and watching. And now, for the first time in living memory, word came that the watching had faltered. Thucydides tells us what the Helots did with that moment. Above all, the Messenians, the unfree, took up arms. Exactly as Aristotle would later say, they always waited to do. Reading Spartan disaster as opportunity. Tradition preserves a scene of the young king Archidamus sounding the alarm among the ruins and forming the survivors into a line of battle, which is said to have saved the town itself. The rebels withdrew west and fortified Mount Ithome, the sacred mountain of Messenia, and Sparta, victor of Plataea, could not dig them out. The siege dragged on for years. Now watch what fear does, because the next episode helped break the Greek world in half. Sparta, struggling, called on its allies, including Athens. Still formally a partner from the Persian Wars, Athens sent 4,000 hoplites under Cimon, the leading friend of Sparta in Athenian politics. And then the Spartans looked at this democratic army camped inside their country, so near the Helots, so full of dangerous ideas, and, Thucydides says, grew afraid of their boldness and their revolutionary spirit, fearing they might side with the rebels. So Sparta sent the Athenians home, alone among all the allies. No explanation that fooled anyone. The insult detonated in Athens. Cimon's pro-Spartan policy collapsed, and Athenian politics swung toward the men who saw Sparta as the enemy. Thucydides marks this humiliation as the first open quarrel between the two powers. Hold the sequence, because it matters to everything ahead. The earthquake shook Sparta. The Helots rose. And Sparta's fear of its own workforce poisoned its greatest alliance. The road to the coming war had many lanes. Athenian ambition, Corinthian grievance, the pride of 2 blocks. And Thucydides famously judged that the truest cause was the growth of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Sparta. But one major lane ran, unmistakably, through Messenia. When modern strategists speak of the Thucydides trap, the danger that arises when a rising power frightens an established one, they are quoting a judgment written about Sparta's state of mind. And part of what Sparta feared for was never Athens at all. It was the valley behind the mountain. The revolt ended in a telling compromise. The rebels on Ithome finally came down under a truce, on terms that they leave the Peloponnese forever. And Athens, in a gesture of pure spite and pure foresight, settled them at a port called Naupactus on the Corinthian Gulf. Free Messenians, armed, organized, and unforgetting, parked on the sea lanes, waiting for the day Athens might need men who hated Sparta more than anyone alive. That day was coming. The next 3 decades were an armed peace, broken by an inconclusive first round of fighting and patched by a treaty optimistically named the 30 Years' Peace. It lasted 14. Athens grew richer, its empire tighter, and its walls, crucially, longer. Great stone corridors running from the city to its harbors, so that no land army could ever starve it while its fleet ruled the sea. Sparta watched, and its allies, Corinth loudest among them, complained that Athenian power was swallowing the world while Sparta drilled in its valley. And one more reading of the citizen count before the fire. At Krypteia, Sparta fielded 5,000. By the eve of the Great War, reconstructions built from Thucydides suggest the equals had fallen to somewhere near 4,000. And sinking, no plague had struck them, no battle had bled them white. The decline ran quieter than that. Through land, inheritance, and the mess dues that turned poverty into expulsion. And we will open that machinery fully 2 chapters from now. 9,000. Once, by tradition, 5,000 at Plataea, roughly 4,000 now. Sparta was about to fight the longest war in Greek history with a shrinking citizen body. Against an enemy its spears could not reach. Behind walls its system had no answer for. It would win anyway, and the way it won would cost it almost everything it believed about itself. Chapter 9. The Peloponnesian War winning everything. Losing the point. The war that began in 431 BC looks, at first glance, like a mismatch with an obvious script. Sparta had the most feared land army in Greece. Athens had a fortified city, an empire of tribute, and the greatest navy afloat. Each side was supreme in an element the other could not enter. And Thucydides, who served as an Athenian general in this war before exile, turned him into its historian, understood from the beginning that this was why it would be long. Sparta's opening strategy was almost touchingly simple. March into Athenian territory, burn the farms, and wait for Athens to come out and fight like men. Athens, guided by its leading statesman, Pericles, declined. The population withdrew behind the walls. The fleet raided the Peloponnese, and the empire's silver kept the city fed by sea. The Spartans stood in the smoke of Athenian farmland. Unbeatable and irrelevant, they could win any battle offered, and no battle was offered. Aristotle's warning is already visible in miniature. A state shaped for one kind of war struggles to imagine another. What broke the stalemate first was not strategy, but biology. In 430 BC, a plague, its identity still debated by modern researchers, erupted inside the packed city of Athens. Thucydides caught it himself, survived, and left a clinical description so exact that scientists still mine it for diagnoses. The true death toll is unknown. Modern estimates often place it somewhere around a quarter of the population, perhaps more, and among the dead was Pericles himself. Athens staggered, and did not fall. Then, in 425 BC, came the event that should have ended the Spartan legend a generation before Leuctra, and it happened at a place called Pylos, on the coast of, note the address, Messenia. An Athenian force fortified the headland, and the free Messenians of Naupactus, the exiles Athens had pocketed a generation earlier, came home as raiders, spreading fear of revolt through the Helot countryside. Sparta reacted exactly as Chapter 5 taught you it must. with total commitment, throwing troops onto the barren island of Sphacteria beside the bay to control the harbour. The operation went wrong. The Athenian fleet returned, won the water, and the force on the island, 440 hoplites, was cut off. For weeks, Sparta negotiated. The blockade held, and finally Athens stormed the island. In the fighting, about 150 of the trapped men were killed, their commander among them. And then the world turned upside down. The survivors, 292 men, of whom about 120 were full Spartan citizens of the equals, out of water, ringed on a cliff top, did not fight to the death. They surrendered. Thucydides records the reaction of Greece as something close to disbelief. Nothing in the whole war. He writes, so astonished the Greeks, for they had believed Spartans would never yield their arms for any reason, but would die holding them, as at Thermopylae. 120 living, breathing equals were shipped to Athens and paraded as hostages, and every stroll past their prison told the Greek world the same quiet message. The men of the pass were mortal after all, and Sparta's response showed how deep the wound went. The state that supposedly scorned negotiation sued for peace, repeatedly, offering remarkable terms, because those 120 men were not just soldiers. Set them against the citizen count, and they amount to something like 3% of the entire body. And behind them, Pylos still stood, a lit match held beside Messenia. Athens, flush with the win, refused every offer. The war ground on, and the stalemate was finally broken by the kind of unusually flexible individual Sparta's system rarely encouraged. His name was Brasidas, and he is worth pausing over, because he is the great exception that measures the rule. Every institution you have watched Sparta build was designed to produce men who were interchangeable, obedient, and silent. Brasidas was none of it. He was quick where Sparta was slow, persuasive where Sparta was mute, and Thucydides, who lost his own command and his homeland to the man's speed, pays him the historian's highest compliment, reporting that his conduct and intelligence did Sparta more good abroad than armies. In 424 BC, Brasidas marched a small force the length of Greece and began talking Athenian subject cities into revolt, presenting himself as a liberator from empire, and being believed, and notice who marched at his back. 700 Helots, armed by the state, and promised freedom for their service. Read that against everything you know. The regime that, by Thucydides' own account, had garlanded and disappeared 2,000 Helots was now arming them, because the arithmetic of the equals no longer allowed anything else. The system had begun conscripting the people it feared. Brasidas died winning his greatest battle, at Amphipolis, in 422 BC, and with him and his Athenian opposite number both gone. The exhausted sides signed a peace that settled nothing. The war smouldered through proxies and broken clauses. And then Athens committed one of the most catastrophic strategic errors in classical history. In 415 BC, it launched a massive invasion of Sicily, a second war of choice against the greatest city of the Greek West. 2 years later, the entire expedition, 2 fleets, tens of thousands of men, had been destroyed at Syracuse. Thucydides closes the account with the flattest, devastating sentence he ever wrote. Few out of many returned home. Now Sparta moved in for the kill. And here is the turn the statues never mention. Sparta did not win this war with the phalanx, the upbringing, or the code of Leonidas. It won with the 2 instruments its whole self-image claimed to scorn: foreign money and ships. The money was Persian, in one of history's sharper ironies. The state whose prestige rested on resistance to the great king now sent envoys to his satraps, and from 412 BC onward accepted Persian gold to build fleets while bargaining away the freedom of the Greek cities of Asia, the very cause the Persian wars had been fought over. Xenophon and Thucydides record the deals matter-of-factly, because there was nothing else to record. Sparta could not outbuild the Athenian navy, so it outsourced the bill. At the court of the old enemy, whatever the men who signed thought of themselves, the transaction speaks for itself, and it will not be the last time in this story that Spartan practice quietly buries Spartan principle. The ships needed a commander, and the system produced its second fatal individual. Lysander, brilliant, tireless, and everything the upbringing pretended to make impossible. A builder of personal networks. A courtier who charmed the Persian prince Cyrus into opening the treasury. A patron who installed client oligarchs in city after city. Loyal less to Sparta than to Lysander, he hunted the Athenian fleet with a patience no Spartan land general had ever shown. Declined battle after battle, and waited, in 405 BC, at a beach in the Hellespont called Agoge. He caught the last great navy of Athens, drawn up on the sand. Its crews scattered foraging, and took it almost without a fight. Around 170 ships, thousands of prisoners, the Athenians among them executed. The grain route from the Black Sea, the artery that fed Athens, was cut. The end was hunger, not battle. Athens held out under blockade into 404 BC, then surrendered. The long walls, the stone corridors that had made Spartan invincibility irrelevant for a generation, were pulled down. Xenophon says, to the music of flute girls, while the allies celebrated, believing that day was the beginning of freedom for Greece. 27 years after it began, Sparta stood alone at the top of the Greek world, and the citizen count, one more time, because it is the truest scoreboard of this war. 9,000 by tradition, 5,000 at Plataea, 4,000 at the war's opening. By its end, reconstructions suggest the equals numbered somewhere near 3,000, and falling. Meanwhile, the treasuries of Sparta, the state that told itself gold was poison, now held more coined wealth than any city in Greece. And it was pooling, quietly, in exactly the few hands the official story said did not exist. Aristotle's warning is about to come due. A state built for one kind of war had just won the last war it understood. The next enemy would not be an empire, or a fleet, or a rival city. It would be the ledger. Chapter 10. Leuctra, the day the myth died. Victory is a test, and Sparta failed it with extraordinary speed. The year is 404 BC. Athens has fallen. Sparta commands the Greek world. Garrisons cities from the Aegean to the Isthmus, and holds Persian gold in its treasury. Within a single generation, all of it will be gone, and Spartan power will be broken so completely that it never returns. A collapse that fast has to be explained, not just narrated, and the sources let us watch 3 separate failures working at once. The first failure was money, and it started at the top. Plutarch reports that when Lysander's war treasure rolled into Sparta, respected voices urged the ephors to refuse it, warning that coined silver and gold would corrupt everything they had. They were overruled, and the state settled on a compromise of perfect hypocrisy. Public wealth was now legal. Private wealth remained forbidden, which meant, as Plutarch dryly observes, that it simply moved indoors. And here the deep gears of the citizen count finally come into view. So watch closely, because this is the autopsy of Sparta. A man remained one of the equals only while he paid his mess dues from the produce of his land. But Spartan land could pass by inheritance and gift. And around this era, a law attributed to an ephor named Epitideius, reported by Plutarch, though doubted in its details by some modern scholars, made land fully transferable. However exactly it happened, the direction is beyond dispute, because Aristotle saw the results with his own eyes. Land concentrated, generation by generation, into fewer hands, including, as he recorded with irritation, the hands of wealthy women. Every household that slipped below the property line lost its citizenship. Permanently, the sons of equals became a class the Spartans called, with brutal simplicity, the inferiors. Men raised in the Agoge, trained for the phalanx, and stripped of everything it had promised them. Sparta had built a machine for turning its own citizens into internal exiles, and it ran faster every decade. Aristotle, performing the post-mortem a generation later in his Politics, gave the disease its name, oliganthropia, shortage of men. The land of Sparta, he wrote, could have supported 1,500 cavalry and 30,000 hoplites. Yet the citizen number had sunk below 1,000. And the city, he concluded, was destroyed by lack of men, not by Persia, not by Athens, by arithmetic. Follow the count one last time, remembering what it is. A chain of estimates from different kinds of evidence, but a chain that only ever runs one way. 9,000 by tradition, 5,000 at Plataea, 3,000 after the Great War, and now, entering the era of Leuctra, the reconstructions allow perhaps 12 to 1,500. Inside a state still holding tens of thousands of Helots. The second failure was empire. Sparta had marketed itself across the Aegean for a generation as the liberator of Greece. And the morning after victory, the customers discovered what they had bought. Lysander's client oligarchies. Boards of 10 collaborators backed by Spartan governors. In city after city. In Athens itself, Sparta imposed the junta remembered as the 30 tyrants, whose reign of confiscation and murder was so vicious that democracy was restored within about a year, with the quiet acquiescence of a Spartan king who had tired of Lysander's private empire. Within a decade of winning everything, Sparta achieved what Athens never had. It united Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and a revived Athens against it in a single coalition, funded, in the crowning irony, by Persia, whose agents now rode the Aegean handing out gold against Sparta. When that exhausted round of fighting ended in 386 BC, the settlement was dictated from the Persian court, and its first clause handed the Greek cities of Asia to the great king outright, with Sparta as the treaty's enforcer in Greece. Set that beside the graves at Thermopylae and let it sit. Xenophon simply transcribes the terms. The third failure was the oldest one, and it walked on two legs. In 382 BC, a Spartan commander passing through central Greece seized, in peacetime, without provocation, the fortress of Thebes and installed a puppet government. Even Xenophon, Sparta's lifelong admirer, treats what followed as heaven's judgment on a broken oath. 3 years later, Theban exiles retook their city in a night coup, and Sparta had converted a resentful neighbor into the instrument of its own destruction. Because Thebes now brought forward 2 commanders of the kind the Spartan system was poorly equipped to cultivate, Peloponnesian, the daring leader of its elite corps, and Epaminondas. Stay with Epaminondas a moment, because he is the hinge of the century and one of the most attractive figures in all Greek history. He was an aristocrat who stayed poor by choice, a student of Pythagorean philosophy, a man who, the later sources say, owned one good cloak and stayed home when it was being washed. Cicero, centuries afterward, called him perhaps the first man of Greece. The tradition around him is admiring and late, so we hold the anecdotes loosely. What is not anecdote is what he did between 371 and 362 BC, because it is written across the map of Greece to this day. Sparta's whole position rested on two assumptions: that no one could beat the Spartan phalanx in open battle, and that no one would dare touch the foundations underneath it. Epaminondas examined both, and broke both. In July of 371 BC, a Spartan-led army of perhaps 10 to 11,000 men met roughly 6 to 7,000 Thebans and allies on a plain in Boeotia called Leuctra. On paper, routine, Sparta had the numbers, the prestige, and a king, Cleombrotus, commanding about 700 citizen equals, the largest concentration of true Spartiates left anywhere on earth. Here is what centuries of Greek battle habit looked like, so you can see what changed. Armies loaded their best troops on their own right wing, so battles turned like revolving doors, each right wing winning, and the stronger army grinding out a decision. Epaminondas declined the custom. The ancient accounts of the battle differ in detail, and modern reconstructions argue over the exact geometry. But the central innovation is clear in all of them. He massed his striking force, with the elite sacred band under Pelopidas on his left, directly opposite the Spartan king and the citizen equals, stacking it enormously deep. The tradition says 50 shields. Against a dozen, he held back his weaker wing, advancing at an angle, so that his hammer landed first and the rest of the field barely mattered. The finest infantry in Greece was struck by a column built to break exactly them. The equals did not run. The sources agree they fought, wheeled, tried to widen their front, and died where their training told them to stand. Cleombrotus fell, the first reigning Spartan king to be killed in a major pitched battle against other Greeks in living memory. And when it was over, Xenophon, who loved Sparta and had to write the paragraph anyway, records the count of about 700 citizen equals on that field. 400 were dead. Set 400 against a total citizen body that the reconstructions place near 12 to 1500, and depending on which reconstruction you trust. Sparta lost something approaching a third of its citizens in an afternoon. Now come down from the battlefield and stand in the town when the news arrives. Because Xenophon, who may have been close to these events, preserves the scene. It was the last day of a festival, and the chorus of men was performing when the messenger reached the ephors. They did not stop the festival. They let the chorus finish. They sent the names of the dead to the families, and they issued an instruction that the women were not to cry aloud. The next morning, Xenophon writes, you could see the relatives of the fallen moving through the town, bright-faced and open, while the relatives of the survivors seemed to be in mourning, and the few who appeared went about. He says, gloomy and ashamed. It is the most Spartan scene ever recorded. The performance held together while the ground gives way. And it was a performance. The same government quietly declined to enforce the ancient law against men who survived a defeat, because applying it after Leuctra would have abolished what remained of the army. Sparta could still act the part. It could no longer afford the play. Then Epaminondas did the thing that makes him, in this film's judgment, the most consequential general Greece ever produced. Anyone can win a battle. Epaminondas had understood, from outside, what this film has been showing you from inside, that Spartan power did not rest on the phalanx. It rested on Messenia. In the winter of 370 to 369 BC, he marched a vast allied army into Laconia itself, where no invader had stood in centuries. Spartan women, Plutarch says, saw the smoke of enemy fires for the first time in living memory. The unwalled town was saved by flooded winter rivers, by desperate defense, and by the fact that it was never his real target. He crossed Taygetus into Messenia, and he ended it. After roughly 3 centuries of helotage, the Messenians were called home. Exiles returned from Naupactus, from Sicily, from North Africa, on the slopes of Mount Ithome, the mountain of every revolt. Epaminondas founded the city of Messene, with fortifications so massive that travelers marveled at them for centuries, and their remains still stand today. Walls. For the people who had been denied everything, the message needed no inscription. But if it had one, it would read, "You will never come back over that mountain again." Understand what actually died that winter, and what did not. Sparta, the town, survived. It kept its kings, fought on in the wars of the next decades, and will surprise us more than once before this story ends. But the economic foundation of the classical Spartan system, the Helot labor of Messenia that had paid for every mess and every allotment, was gone, and with it the possibility of ever again being what it had been. Epaminondas himself fell in his final victory at Mantinea in 362 BC, and Xenophon ends his history there, writing that after the battle there was even more confusion in Greece than before. He was too close to see what we can see. At Leuctra, the legend of invincibility died. In Messenia, the engine that had powered the legend was taken away. What remains? When a state loses the thing it was organized around, but keeps the greatest name in the world. The next 2 centuries answer that, and the answer is stranger than anything the legend ever promised. Chapter 11. The Theme Park Centuries. There is a construction project, in the generations after Leuctra, that tells you everything about what Sparta had become, and it involves the one thing Sparta swore it would never need. By the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, with the wars of Alexander's successors washing across Greece, the sources record Sparta beginning to protect itself with fieldworks, ditches and palisades thrown up against approaching armies. And in the following decades, as the threats kept coming, the defenses grew, stage by stage, until Sparta was ringed, eventually, by permanent walls like any other city. Pause on that. For 4 centuries, the proudest boast in Greece had been the open town, guarded by men alone. Chapter 1 asked you to remember it. And this is the harvest. The walls of Sparta went up in the very era when the men of Sparta could no longer be the walls. No ancient writer records the debate, or the feeling in the town as the work went forward. Perhaps that silence is the record. The town behind those defenses spent the next 2 centuries in a condition history has no dignified word for, and the road there ran through episodes of real, and sometimes astonishing, drama, a brand that powerful does not fade quietly. First came the humiliations. When Philip, the second of Macedon, broke Greek independence at Cheronea in 338 BC, Sparta refused to join his new order, and tradition preserves the exchange that followed. Philip wrote warning that if he brought his army into Laconia, he would drive the Spartans out and level their city. The Spartans sent back a one-word answer, if. It is the finest one-liner in Spartan history, the laconic style at its absolute peak. And this film would never deny you the pleasure of it. Now, here is the rest, which the posters leave off. Philip did march into Laconia. He ravaged the country, stripped Sparta of border districts and handed them to his allies, including the free Messenians. And Sparta could do nothing but watch. The word won immortality. Philip won the land, and when Alexander crossed into Asia and shattered Persia, he sent captured Persian armor to Athens with a dedication that every Greek could decode, inscribed from Alexander and the Greeks, except the Spartans. The city that had once led the resistance to the great king was now a name great powers used for irony. A Spartan king named Agis III did try, raising a war against Macedon while Alexander was deep in Asia, and died fighting at Megalopolis in 331 BC. With real courage. The sources agree. Alexander, told of the campaign, is said to have dismissed it as a battle of mice. Whether he truly said it, the line survived because it captured what the world now heard in the name of Sparta. Then, remarkably, came the revolutionaries, and their story deserves a film of its own. In the middle of the 3rd century BC, two young kings looked squarely at what Sparta had become. Plutarch, drawing on the contemporary historian Herodotus, gives the figures, and by now you can hear the citizen count reaching its floor. Perhaps 700 citizens remained, of whom maybe 100 families held effectively all the land. A town of debt, luxury at the top, and dead institutions. Wearing the name Sparta like an inherited uniform, King Agis IV proposed the full reboot, cancellation of debts, redivision of the land into thousands of new citizen lots, restoration of the old training. The propertied class outmaneuvered him, and in 241 BC he was strangled in prison. A long, tradition adds, with his mother and grandmother, wealthy women who had backed the program with their fortunes. Remember Aristotle's 2/5, the wealth of Spartan women, blamed by philosophers for the decline, died in this story on the side of reform. A decade later, King Cleomenes III tried again without the scruples. He struck first, had the ephors cut down at their own dinner table, abolished the office, cancelled debts, minted new citizens by the thousand, revived a version of the Agoge, and unleashed the reborn army so effectively that the powers of Greece panicked. And here the irony completes its circuit. Sparta's enemies invited in Macedon, and at Silesia in 222 BC. The experiment was crushed. Cleomenes fled to Egypt and died there in a failed rising. Macedonian troops occupied Sparta, the first foreign conqueror ever to hold the town. The revolution had lasted a summer, and its lesson is the lesson of the whole system. Stated one last time, Sparta was so completely built against change that in the end it could not even restore itself. It could only reenact. The last independent ruler, Nabis, held Sparta around the turn of the 2nd century BC, with a program historians still argue over. Part revolutionary, freeing Helots and redistributing land. Part strongman, and the hostile sources add lurid details. Piracy, extortion, even a torture device built in the likeness of his wife. Details we report as what they are. The claims of his enemies. Rome, the new superpower, dismantled him in stages. And in 195 BC, a Roman-led coalition broke Spartan power permanently, stripping the coast and the conquests. Within a generation, Sparta was forced into the regional Achaean League. And in 146 BC, the year on this video's thumbnail, Rome crushed that league, burned Corinth as a warning to Greece, and folded the Greek world into what became a Roman province. Sparta's run as an independent power begun with 5 villages beside the Eurotas around 900 BC. ends here, in the fine print of Roman administration. But the name did not end. And now we arrive at the strangest scenes in this entire story. The ones almost no documentary tells. Under Roman rule, Sparta prospered, and it prospered by trading on exactly one asset: its past. Educated Romans were fascinated by old Sparta, its discipline, its sayings, its severity, and Sparta became something close to a heritage destination, a place people traveled to in order to see the famous hardness with their own eyes. The town revived the Agoge, or a costumed descendant of it. As a civic institution, old rituals were staged with new intensity, and the centerpiece stood at the ancient sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where an old ordeal of Spartan boyhood, a ritual whipping at the altar, became a famous public spectacle, known across the Mediterranean world. Here we have eyewitnesses, and one of them is famous. The Roman writer Cicero recorded that at this altar, Spartan boys were whipped before onlookers, enduring it in silence. Sometimes, he was told, to the point of death, without a single cry. Centuries later, the spectacle was still running, still drawing visitors, and the archaeology delivers the final detail. Excavating the sanctuary, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Roman-era structure with tiered seating, built in the 3rd century AD, curving around the ancient altar, so that spectators could watch in comfort. Read the stones, because there is no better image of what the machine had become. The altar was real, the ordeal was real, the boys were real, and the spectators sat in permanent seating, constructed around a ritual of endurance, watching Sparta perform Sparta. The travel writer Pausanias walked through the town in the 2nd century AD and found a modest provincial place living on monuments, tombs, and stories. And Thucydides' ancient prediction, the one that opened this film, was already coming true in the most literal way. Visitors stood inside Sparta, struggling to believe this had been the master of Greece. So the word can be said now. Sparta had become a kind of ancient theme park, a town whose main product was the performance of its own memory. And here is the closing thought of the ancient story, offered as this film's judgment. Sparta was never conquered in the way the legend would have demanded. In some final blaze at the gates, Persia never took it. Athens never took it. It was hollowed out by its own design, and when the substance was gone, the design itself became the exhibit. The first casualty of the Spartan myth was Sparta. And yet, walk out of the little Roman town, out of the valley, out of the ancient world entirely, and the strangest fact of this whole story comes into view. The city faded. The name conquered the planet. Over the next 2,000 years, it will be claimed by philosophers and revolutionaries, schoolmasters and dictators, movie studios and gyms and politicians. Every one of them, in a sense, taking a seat in that stone theatre, watching a Sparta built for the audience. How a faded Greek town became the most durable legend in Western history is our next chapter. And it begins with a quiet man in a study, writing lives. Chapter 12. How Sparta Conquered the World. After it died, around the year 100 AD, in a small town in central Greece, a priest of Apollo sat writing paired biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, and without intending anything of the kind, he built the vessel that would carry Sparta across 2,000 years. His name was Plutarch, and you have met him in nearly every chapter, because he is the source of much of what the world thinks it knows about Sparta, the life of Lycurgus, the sayings of Spartan mothers, the boy and the fox. Come back with your shield, or on it. Let yous be fair to him. Because this film has leaned on him too. Plutarch was not a fraud and not a fool. He read widely in earlier sources now lost to us. He often flags disagreements among them. And we have watched him do it, throwing up his hands over Lycurgus, refusing to believe the worst about the Krypteia. But he wrote moral biography, not critical history in the modern sense. He was collecting character, examples of virtue and vice for the education of his readers. And the character he transmitted for Sparta, disciplined, selfless, and corruptible, laconic, was substantially the ideal that Sparta and its admirers had polished for centuries. Scholars, following the historian François Ollier, have a name for that polished image. They call it the Spartan mirage, the reflection that floats above the real place. Part truth, part wish. Nearly everything in this chapter is the story of Europe falling in love with the reflection. Watch it travel. When Plutarch returned to wide circulation in the Renaissance, his Spartans struck European readers with the force of revelation. Machiavelli, hunting antiquity for durable constitutions, praised Sparta in his discourses for its long stability under one set of laws. In the 1760s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau held Sparta up as the model of citizens formed wholly for the public. A republic, he wrote, of demigods rather than men. A generation later, the men of the French Revolution had been raised on exactly this reading, and said so constantly. Orators invoked Lycurgus by name. There were proposals for civic festivals and Spartan-style education. Some of the men who administered the terror also spoke in the language of Lycurgus and Spartan civic virtue, which is one of history's bleaker footnotes. A revolution of pure reason, reaching back for a valley of iron discipline. The English-speaking world caught the fever in its own key. The elite boarding schools of Victorian Britain consciously advertised cold dormitories, hard discipline, and games over comfort. An Agoge for the administrators of an empire. And the word Spartan settled into everyday English as a compliment. Across the Atlantic, as we saw in Chapter 3, the American founders studied the Spartan constitution among their classical models. Samuel Adams hoped Boston might become a Christian Sparta, and Thomas Jefferson, reading closer, recoiled, describing the Spartans in his letters as military monks. The difference between those two readings is, in miniature, the argument of this entire film. Then the mirage reached the 20th century, and the love turned lethal. Nazi Germany embraced Sparta, and this passage will be exact, because exactness is the only responsible way to tell it. Hitler praised Sparta in his pronouncements as a racial state and commended its treatment of weak infants, the very tradition whose physical evidence, you will recall, is at best ambiguous. Nazi race theorists declared the Dorians a northern, Germanic people, so that the self-styled master race could claim the most famous master class in history as kin. Elite Nazi schools were consciously modelled, their founders said, on Spartan lines, and the historian Helen Roche, whose research traces Sparta in German education, has documented how deep the identification ran. It ran to the very end, in January of 1943, with the German Sixth Army dying at Stalingrad. Hermann Goering gave a radio address comparing the doomed soldiers to Leonidas at Thermopylae, reciting the epitaph of the pass over an army that had not yet finished dying. Soldiers in the pocket heard the broadcast, and some recorded their disgust at being buried in words while still alive. Say the historical judgment carefully, because it matters. The Nazi reading of Sparta was a selective and racialized appropriation. It seized the eugenic legend and the obedience and the sacrifice, and it ignored the checks and balances, the poverty of the kings, the mockery Spartans aimed at bluster. It was not the only possible reading, and it distorted much, but it did not invent from nothing. Either, it found real material to exploit in the legend's celebration of hierarchy, discipline, and death before surrender. And that is the permanent caution of the episode. A myth polished for 20 centuries becomes a mirror, and mirrors do not choose who looks into them. After such a chapter, you might expect the brand to die of shame. Instead, it went to the movies. In 1962 came the film The 300 Spartans, a Cold War Thermopylae with the Persian Empire standing in, unsubtly, for the totalitarian East. In the audience, as he often recalled in interviews, was a boy named Frank Miller, who never got over it, and who in 1998 published 300, a comic book retelling stripped down to myth, blood, and bronze. In 2007, the director Zack Snyder's film adaptation of that comic reached theaters, and the modern Sparta legend detonated. The movie earned over $450 million worldwide, spawned a sequel, and fixed a permanent image in the global imagination. The lone 300, the monstrous Persians, the sculpted bodies, the war cry. Historians spent years afterward patiently listing the departures from evidence, and this film has spent an hour doing the same. The 7,000 allies restored, the Helots restored, the Thespians restored. But the most historically interesting thing about the movie is not its errors. It is that it worked. 24 centuries downstream, using material first compressed by ancient memory itself, the film did not invent the editing. It inherited it, and finished it in high definition. And the inheritance keeps paying. Walk through American and European culture today, and count. Spartan is the name of one of the world's largest obstacle race companies, with millions of paying participants crawling through mud under a Spartan helmet logo. Gyms, supplement brands, and fitness programs wear the name and the lambda shield. Michigan State University fields its teams as the Spartans, one of hundreds of schools that do. And in American politics, the phrase "Mollen Lebe," come and take them, the answer tradition attributes to Leonidas when ordered to surrender his weapons, has become a slogan of the gun rights movement, printed on flags and stickers and engraved on rifle components. A line from the Mirage doing live political work in the 21st century. Whatever you make of any single use, notice what they share. Each one purchases the reflection, the discipline, the defiance, the elite brotherhood, and leaves the rest of the invoice unread. The Helots, the surrender at Sphacteria, the Persian gold, the empty valley. So here is the summary judgment of 24 centuries of afterlife, offered openly as this film's own. Sparta is not remembered, chiefly because of the wars it won. Athens beat it at sea. Thebes broke it on land, and its own ledger emptied it at home. Sparta is remembered because its story proved endlessly useful, and every age since has dressed its own obsessions in the red cloak. Civic virtue for Rousseau, cold showers for the Victorians, race for the Nazis, freedom for the Cold War, toughness for the gym. The Mirage is a mirror, and what each era sees in Sparta is mostly itself. Flexing, which leaves only the question this film promised you in its opening minute. Step out of the mirror, stand in the actual valley, weigh the actual evidence. Was there anything real underneath worth admiring? One chapter remains. Let's go back to the Eurotas and settle the account. Chapter 13. What Sparta asks of us. Go back, one last time, to the valley where we started. Stand on the banks of the Eurotas in the early morning. In the modern town of Sparta, laid out in the 1830s on the ancient ground, Taygetus still holds the western sky. Snow on the ridge into late spring. The river still comes down past the olive groves, as it came down past the 5 villages. On a low hill at the edge of town lie the excavations, a Roman-era theatre, scattered foundations, and out along the old road, the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where the curve of the seating can still be traced in the ground. Tour buses come, but not many. Most drive on to the Byzantine ruins of Mistras on the mountainside, which are far more photogenic. Thucydides called it perfectly. 24 centuries out. Standing here, you would never believe it. But you have seen the evidence now. All of it that survives. Gaps and arguments shown rather than smoothed. So let us do what we promised and settle the account openly, as one film's judgment, with the reasons attached so you can dispute every one of them. Begin with what was real. Because it was real. The discipline was not a myth. Thucydides, no admirer, describes the calm, flute-paced advance that unnerved every enemy in Greece. The courage was not a myth. The pass happened. The last morning happened. And at Leuctra, the equals died in their ranks when running would have saved them. The stability was not a myth. While other Greek cities cycled through coups and massacres, Sparta held one constitutional order for centuries. And minds from Aristotle to the founders of the American Republic found real engineering worth studying in its balanced design. And the women of Sparta's citizen class held property, voice, and standing that their Athenian sisters could not have imagined. A fact that embarrassed Greece then, and complicates every tidy verdict now. Now set the other pan on the scale. Every one of those achievements was purchased with the same coin. And the coin was Messenia. The discipline was shaped in large part by the need to control a subjugated population. The stability was the stillness of a garrison that dared not change anything. Ever. And in the end, could not change even to save itself. The equality of the equals floated on the labor of the unfree majority. Watched by institutions dark enough that Sparta's own ancient admirers tried to explain them away. And stained, if Thucydides reports truly, by the disappearance of 2,000 men, whose only recorded offense was answering when courage was called for. The defense of the pass belonged to roughly 7,000, and the final morning to Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and unfree attendants whose circumstances differed, and memory awarded all of it to 300. And the system did not even keep faith with its own. It confiscated childhood, thinned family into a night visit, produced commanders who broke like cheap iron the moment they touched money and power abroad, and then, through its own property rules, expelled its citizens from citizenship faster than any enemy ever killed them. 9,000, 5,000, 3,000, 700, by our best and honest reckoning. Aristotle wrote the epitaph in one line, destroyed by lack of men. So here is the verdict of this film. Sparta was not the greatest city in Greece. It was the greatest performance in Greece. A society that spent itself perfecting the image of strength, and won immortality in the one arena where image is everything. The human imagination. As a state, it stands as antiquity's sternest warning about what a society becomes when it organizes everything around a single virtue. Aristotle said, a state built only for war cannot survive peace. And Sparta proceeded to demonstrate it so exactly that his analysis reads like prophecy. If you are looking for the Greeks who built what we still live in, the mathematics, the drama, the philosophy, the vote, they lived, mostly, in the loud, chaotic, infuriating city that Sparta fought, not in the silent one by the Eurotas. And yet the scale will not sit level, and honesty requires saying why. Athens, our luminous alternative, ran on tens of thousands of slaves, worked some of them to death namelessly in its silver mines, kept its citizen women in shadows Sparta never imposed on its own, and voted, democratically, with a show of hands, for at least one massacre of a defeated people. The difference between Sparta and its rivals was never innocence. It was that Sparta systematized what others improvised, and then, fatally for its reputation, left almost no voices of its own. A few poots, some inscriptions, sayings polished by other people's writers. Athens wrote constantly, about everything, including about Sparta, and so the verdict of history on Sparta was drafted, from the beginning, by outsiders. There is a lesson in that colder than any battlefield, and it may be the most practical one in this entire film. The cities that write more shape the memory of the cities that write less. That was true in the 4th century BC, and you live in an age that proves it every single day. That is what Sparta finally asks of us. And notice that it is not admiration. It asks us to watch what we are doing when we admire. Every era of the long afterlife looked into the Spartan mirage and saw its own face. And ours does too. When a politician quotes Molon Labe, when a gym sells the Lambda shield, when a movie gives the 300 perfect bodies and quietly deletes the enslaved men who carried their food, the theatre at Artemis Orthia fills again. Spectators in tiered seats, watching a performance of toughness staged for the audience. 24 centuries, and the show has never once closed. The question was never really what Sparta was. You now know what it was, as nearly as the evidence allows, and where the evidence runs out. You know that too. The question is what each of us keeps coming back to watch. So decide, and mean it, knowing everything you now know. The valley and the villages, Messenia and the hidden ones, the pass and the long editing of its memory, Leuctra and the ledger, the walls that finally went up and the seats that finally went in. Would you call Sparta great? An open, written, public argument, the kind anyone can join and no one can silence, would have sat uneasily inside the Spartan ideal of silence and conformity. So hold it in their honor, and against them, put your answer below, and defend it with evidence. The river keeps no memory. It never did. The Eurotas comes down from the mountains this morning, as it came down past the first 5 villages, past the boys cutting reeds along its banks, past the campfires of Epaminondas, past the Roman visitors and the quiet centuries, and it carries nothing, remembers nothing, promises nothing. Memory was always the work of people. The people are gone, and what they left behind is not a city. It is a story. Handle it carefully. Stories are the only things in this world that never surrender.